back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. A year is an arbitrary division of time, which itself is a subjective experience rather than, in some ways, an independently verifiable fact. And yet, it is, we are hardwired to perceive time and to perceive time in a certain way. We are hardwired to measure time in units like years. We are equally hardwired at the end of each year and the beginning of each new year to try to identify and paint an image upon the period of time that has just passed. With that rather random introduction, my next guest has written a piece about the year that has just ended. It was published in NBC's Think page, their commentary page. It is entitled Good Riddance, and of course we don't always pick our own headlines. The headline is Good Riddance to the Year of the Narcissist. The author is my friend Lynn Parramore. Lynn Parramore is a cultural historian and writer, and she joins us now. So first of all, Lynn, welcome back to the program.
Oh, thanks very much for letting me join you today.
And sorry about that, dorm room random rap introduction, but there, yeah, whatever. I gotta be me. But I really enjoyed this piece. It was a really fun read. I'll start with this. What inspired you to write it?
Well, I think like a lot of folks, as we were leading up to the holiday season, where we're supposed to be thinking about gratitude, hopefully, and family and connections, headline after headline just had some grotesque action or comment from public figures ranging from Kanye West, Donald Trump always can be relied on for making obnoxious statements, to Sam Bankman-Fried, to Elon Musk. I mean, it just seemed like you could not get away from this tsunami of really antisocial, manipulative, deceptive, offensive, toxic talk and activity from some of the most powerful people on the planet. And I finally just thought, you said the year is an arbitrary division. So I sort of said, well, good riddance, but we're by no means done with these people. And there will be more to take their place when they finally shut up, if they ever do. I also had the displeasure of watching a lot of the trial with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. And there was a lot of toxic stuff that came out of that. And I just think we just kind of got immersed in it in 2022 in a way that even for our narcissistic culture was a bit extreme.
Yeah, and narcissistic is, obviously it's a clinical term for personality disorder. It's a Greek myth of, someone so beautiful they saw their own reflection and were transfixed. It's also a popular term. And, but the thing about narcissistic personalities in the public sphere is I wonder what our fascination with them tells us as media consumers about ourselves. You know what I'm saying? In other words, if I care so much about, Prince Harry or some of the people you mentioned or whatever, is it because I'm not a narcissist? Is it because I'm a frustrated narcissist? I know it's not per se part of your piece, but I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, this is, you bring up something that I think is important to kind of try to disentangle is, narcissism is one of those terms that has a colloquial sense, a kind of, it has this mythic sense, and it has this clinical sense. And I sort of deliberately didn't use the term narcissistic personality disorder in the piece because I do think that it's good to be mindful of not making clinical diagnoses when one is professional and is not treating a patient. And it's really interesting. Alan Francis, who is a psychiatrist who actually worked on the definitions of personality disorders in one version of the DSM, the manual that clinicians use to diagnose patients, talked about how problematic these terms really are and how arbitrary. So I don't use it in the clinical sense, but I do use it I use it specifically, and I was having a conversation or sort of a disagreement with a friend the other day who was asking whether narcissism was inflated self-esteem. And I think that's a popular conception of it, but I think it's something more pernicious than that as I'm thinking of it and as it's manifesting in some of the people I mentioned. It's more than just thinking you're cool, right? It's a kind of manipulative stance towards other people, thinking of other people as instruments of gratification. There's a caricature kind of in popular culture that a narcissist is somebody with no empathy, and I don't think that's true. But perhaps a challenged empathy, and empathy that doesn't work as quite as well as it should. And I think, to me, this is something I've come to in thinking about this for a while. I think there's a fantasy element in narcissism and narcissistic behavior and traits that's really important. A grandiosity, but also a fantasy space that you invite other people to come into. And it can be a very alluring and intoxicating place. You know, Kanye West presents himself as somebody who was sort of anointed by the cosmos to bring truth and liberty to other human beings. Trump has talked about himself in that sense. Elon Musk talks about himself as kind of the bringer of free speech. And these are very alluring ideas, right? I mean, when you first hear about them, well, who wouldn't want to be standing with Elon Musk for free speech? But there's something very pernicious that operates underneath those fantasies. And you find that these fantasies actually become very destructive, and they don't really mean what the purveyors of them say that they're going to mean. So there's a kind of substratum of deception that goes, and self-deception. I think a lot of these narcissists, as I mentioned in my piece, drink their own Kool-Aid. They believe what they're saying is true. They're not necessarily con artists. They can be, but not necessarily so. They really do believe they're here to save humankind.
And that may also be masking an underlying inferiority complex or whatever. And when I think about the meaning of these personalities and their prominence, and if anything, you're very genteel and reserved in mentioning political figures, we could, it's almost a prerequisite for the position. But I thought of, I spent some time in my 20s, trying to make it as a rock singer and songwriter. And I remember a manager saying to me that in the process of firing me, but a very successful manager, that, it's not, the songs are fine and the singing is fine and all that, but you have to create a world that people want to live in. Yeah. And you have to symbolize that world. And to the extent that you do that, people will be drawn to you. And it wasn't my innate personality to do that for whatever reason. So I really didn't do that. But all of the people you mentioned at one time or another, and for some groups still, have been able to create a world, the illusion of a world. Yes. That people want to live in, right? For
very alluring worlds, yes.
Yeah. Maybe you get rich if it's SPF and you become a crypto king. If it's Kanye, you're smarter and hipper and have better style taste than the rest. If it's I'm trying to think of some of the other Chinese.
Elizabeth Holmes was one I mentioned. We're going to have these wonderful cures. It's going to be great.
Yeah. And, Johnny Depp, to his fans, represents some kind of pirate,
we're going to go on boyish adventures.
Yeah. A man's man, but not afraid to wear mascara, world that they'd loved. So to me, that's all, you're right. It's selling a fantasy. And I think, to me, one of the social issues underlying it, well, there are many, of course, but one, the need to have a fantasy to escape this lousy, quotidian life our society has created for most people. But the other is, the cult of personality, right? That we are we look down on, most Americans mock, North Korea, everybody supposed to worship the great supreme leader, but, we have our own versions of that in celebrities and or political figures. One of the reasons why political debates get so heated, if you attack Hillary or Bernie or Kamala now has taken that on or whatever, you are attacking my identity because that's my person. And then the viciousness comes out. Yeah. So to me, that's all the kind of narcissism you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, and I think you're getting at something that's really important. A narcissist can't operate on his or her own, right? They need people to participate in that fantasy. And so you raise a really interesting question. Why are we so drawn to participation in these fantasies? And I think that goes to some things that are very, very deep about our modern condition, our lack of a sense of meaningfulness, our lack of a sense of purpose, our lack of a sense of connection. One of the interesting things about these sort of people exhibiting narcissistic traits and offering fantasies is they offer community. You get to be part of something, part of a movement, part of a club. I think Donald Trump was very effective in using the desire for community and connection to draw people into his fantasy world. Of course, when you finally get into that fantasy, you realize that the promises of it aren't true. But, you had mentioned something about self-esteem at the very beginning, and I just wanted to touch on this really quickly before we move on, which is that people who really have true grounded self-esteem don't need to go around telling everyone about how great they are, right? And how much they're a savior and how important they are. And I think that's one of the places you can kind of make the distinction as to what's kind of a more narcissistic presentation than true self-esteem. But yeah, and Sam Bankman-Fried is an interesting case. Here's a young guy. Everybody said he was a genius. You're going to get rich if you're in his circle. You're going to leave, there he was in the Bahamas, living in a penthouse, a bunch of young people all living together. Maybe they're polyamorous. They just seem to be having this amazing time and freedom. And, we're involved in cryptocurrency. It's this libertarian fantasy of, we don't need the government involved in money making and getting rich. We can do it all ourselves. And it was a very, very alluring fantasy. And he coded that with a lot of talk about altruism. I mean,
right. And I wanted to get to the altruism.
Yes. Yes.
I always felt, long before the downfall, there was a picture of Sam Bankman-Fried with Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. You've probably seen it, who, they'll basically do anything for money. And he's in his baggy shorts and t-shirt, and they're on either side, and they're $5,000 suits. And, that for a long time has been, as you probably know, for the tech world, that's the uniform of real status. And for show business to a certain extent, too. I lived in Los Angeles for a long time. And if I went to a nice restaurant in sweatpants, I got a lot better service, and just quick story, but someone very close to me in his 30s, was suddenly invited to a very, very high dollar fundraiser by a friend, cocktail party, suits and ties. And he was wearing jeans and a Norwegian death metal band t-shirts and bushy beard and hair. And the most powerful person in the room, who, trust me, was one of the most powerful people in the world at the time, spent like 20 minutes talking to him about their plans for the future and what they intended to do. And he got it, which was, he looked like he must be a tech billionaire or something to be there. He must be the richest guy in the room. This is the reverse snobism now, and
yes.
And that was Sam Bankman-Fried's shtick,
to a T. He walks around in his shorts. He goes to important business meetings wearing a t-shirt. Looks like he hasn't combed his hair lately. And it's wow, you get to be taken seriously and called a genius and handed over, all this money, and you could just look like that. looked like he just got out of bed. Wow, how great is that? How freeing, how anti-snobbery. But you're right. It's a shtick. It's a stance. And he used talk about how he was an altruistic person. He was embedded in his philosophy of altruism and how he was here on this planet to get rich in order to save humanity, right? I'm not getting rich just for my own purposes. I'm getting rich for you, for us, for all human beings, which is just sounds like such a line of BS in retrospect now that we know what he was up to. But at the time, to a lot of people, sounded just wonderful. Look at this kid. He's not interested in material things. He's a different kind of billionaire.
Well,
Different kind of billionaire?
we could go for a long time just talking about effective altruism as a school of thought. And as you know, a lot of philosophers and other people have written about it, advocating for it. But, like many people, I've long had objections to it, concerns about it, and for a variety of reasons, including they're encouraging you to get wealthy in a system that perpetuates inequality. So it's perpetuating inequality, but letting you feel good about yourself in the bargain. But, many reasons why I was disturbed by it. It's all cerebral, and the emotions play a part in, I think, being a whole human being and giving and loving in a whole way. And, we could go on. But what I never thought about before your piece was that another objection I had and hadn't articulated to effective altruism was that it's narcissistic. It says, I'm so smart that I know all the potential consequences of every decision and how that's the butterfly effect of that, how that's going to change the world literally in a million years, that which not only has moral consequences, because if you believe you're going to enable the creation of 1 trillion people through artificial intelligence, consciousness uploading, then anything that gets in the way of that is a massacre of inconceivable proportions. So what's wrong with starving a few 100,000, Africans or something but it's just like, I know, it's a grandiosity too. And that's, and I know I'll get hate mail for it, but that, whatever you think about different schools of thought in effective altruism, how it's applied and all that, it's ego too.
It is. And, there's a sense every time I start hearing discussions about effective altruism, it just sounds like it's also really boils down to rich people know best, kind of building on what you're saying. It's the grandiosity of thinking that what is going to be best for society 10, 15, 20, 50 years down the road, but also that as a rich individual, you are particularly well suited to make those kinds of calls. It's your vision that is a vision we're supposed to be buying into. And that is a big problem. I mean, one of the things that the people I mentioned in my piece have in common is they all have a lot of money, right? And we associate that with all kinds of traits, which they definitely don't seem to always correspond with being rich, might even be contrary to them. And there's a couple of really telling things. I started looking at Sam Bankman-Fried's public statements. Unfortunately, he really likes to hear himself talk, so there's a lot to dig through. And he actually has said at one point during a speech, the altruistic thing is to take chances. That's what you do. You take chances. He didn't mention that it was taking chances with other people's money, with other people's lives, not with himself. And I think there's where the altruistic, grandiose fantasy, you begin to see the pernicious things hiding behind it. It's really altruism that is ultimately self-serving.
Right. And it's also, if you think about it, Lynn Parramore, it's also narcissistic in the sense that it's one of those statements that sounds profound, but doesn't really make sense when you think about it. I mean, why? I mean, is it altruistic of me to step out into traffic? Is it altruistic of me to gamble? Yeah. Sometimes it's altruistic to take risks. Sometimes it's not. But that doesn't make for a good aphorism that makes you sound smart. It's almost another piece of costuming. That's how I take it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's also a great con, right? If you can get people into the mental space where they think that taking chances is the altruistic, the wonderful, the moral, the correct thing to do, maybe they'll be more likely to give you their money. And for Sam
Yeah.
Bankman-Fried, that worked out really well for a time for him.
Right.
So that's the kind of manipulation. It's worse than a meaningless aphorism. I think it's a manipulation tactic.
Yeah, I absolutely. It's totally a manipulation, and which gets me to another, reaction I had to your piece. And again, the year of the narcissist was, in the headline at NBC News. Which is that our society right now and our economy is wired to reward people with these personality traits. I mean, Kanye West, Ye or whatever he's called, and I used to listen to his stuff. I don't anymore, but really talented guy. But he wouldn't be where he is just on his producing or recording talent if he didn't have this, fanatical devotion to his own advancement. Elon Musk, same thing. He's someone else. You mentioned Bankman-Fried. We've already talked about. And the fact is, if you look in industry, if you look in corporations, if you look in politics, the people who are obsessed with winning, and getting the attention, our society, doesn't say, well, let's think about the common good. Our society rewards those people with all the money, all the influence, all the power. And then once in a while, far less often than probably should happen, once in a while, their dark side causes a public eruption in their image, and people go, "What? Are you kidding?" It's like we keep getting fooled by the same. I feel as if it raises profound questions of how do we and can we even reassess our fascination with these pathological personalities, because I don't believe that every society in history was run this way. I feel like it's a new phenomenon, probably post industrial revolution. I could be wrong, but and obviously media plays a big part of it. Media didn't exist before, recent history, but I just don't feel, maybe this is hardwired into human nature and I just don't see it. I don't know.
I tend to think it's something that exists in human nature, but the way a society is set up is going to amplify certain traits, or check them. And we live in a society in which the narcissistic traits are getting amplified rather than checked. And that is a huge problem. I mean, if we go back to the Greek tragedies, there was a warning about what happens to people who have hubris. It doesn't go well for them, and it doesn't go well for the rest of society either. So human beings have been watching out for these characteristics for a long time. I've even read some interesting discussion from anthropologists and biologists who talk about evolution and the structure of animal societies, and the suggestion that, it may very well be that in ancient human communities and even some primate communities, a narcissistic individual is going to be punished and driven out and may not even be able to survive. If you sort of get too big for your britches, you're going to be dealt with because you're seen as something that's destructive to the health and well-being of the rest of the community. But instead of kind of checking these people, we amplify them. And why do we do that? I mean, it really starts in schools, in my view. And others have pointed this out. We teach children to be competitive with each other. If you're telling a child the most important thing for you is to win the race or be the best student and get the best grade on this test, How are you learning to work with other people, to share with other people? Are you going to share your knowledge of what's in the history book when you know it's a zero-sum game, and whoever wins the test is going to be rewarded, and whoever loses, no, of course not. You're going to want to hoard what you have, even if that's your own knowledge. You're not going to want to help a fellow student. I remember in school or when I was a kid, I liked physical activity. I sort of liked swimming around and I liked running and things like that. But I didn't like it when they made it a competition. All of a sudden, somebody had to win and somebody had to lose, and somebody might be crying over here and somebody thought they weren't good enough over there. It took the fun and vitality out of these natural activities that human beings wanted to do. I wanted to ride a horse. I didn't particularly want to race against somebody else on the horse. And so we inculcate this from a very young age. And then, as you say, we wonder why these people are coming out with these antisocial behaviors and programs that are so destructive.
I liked competitive things as a kid when I won them.
Right.
But even then, I think, I knew, okay, I feel sorry for, the kid who lost or whatever. But it brings up so many issues. The one area where I kind of would have liked to hear more, and I know we have time limits, or rather space limits, word limits, and all these things. But certainly, I don't know what's going on. Kanye is mentally, it's no secret that he has psychiatric problems, but you talk about the fact, first of all, and it is interesting that virtually all of the examples that you mention and that I can think of are men.
Yeah.
And that's not a shocker in one sense, because obviously men are encouraged to, boys are encouraged to compete. As you write, boys see too few men in nurturing roles. Society is sexist, but I can't, I wonder what will happen, as we, at a glacial pace address gender inequalities in the workplace, if more women will fit this model as well.
I think I tend to be swayed by people that say that we're going to get more narcissistic behavior and traits out of women. Elizabeth Holmes is an example of this. And it's really interesting to think about the whole gender complexity. She lowered her voice when she spoke deliberately to sound more masculine when she was sort of delivering her con. That's kind of an interesting thing. And I think, again, with the caveat that what we think of as masculinity and femininity, a lot of it is social construct. She was behaving in a way that was supposed to make her seem more masculine and therefore perhaps more trustworthy, somebody that you would trust with business decisions of the magnitude that she was making. So there are some very interesting things that go on here with regard to gender. And I do think, socialization is part of it. We certainly encourage boys even more so to be competitive. When I came along, we didn't even really have Title IX going yet. And so you didn't, as a girl, you just weren't encouraged to participate in competitive sports as much. You didn't get rewarded for it. And even now, you don't get rewarded for it as much. You're not going to get the big football scholarship if you're a girl, right? And become an NFL star. It's still a much lesser thing. And girls are, more expected to share. But I do think there are deeper ways that this gets inculcated in the way we set up sexual arrangements in our society that we're struggling with and trying to transition out of, perhaps. For example, trying to give men parental leave to be with their young children. Maybe that is not only something that's a good business practice, maybe it's something that helps men become more in touch with the nurturing, sharing parts of themselves. And babies and young children need to see that in men. we don't have a lot of men in the nursery and teaching preschool classes and doing that kind of caregiving. And so we don't grow up thinking of men as caregiving beings. We see them as, more competitive beings and less emotional beings. And so that, again, is very, very deep. And we would have to make some pretty large changes, but I don't think they're impossible changes. These sexual arrangements that we have are not written in stone. They're not written in our DNA. We can do it differently.
Yes, of course. And, it would be good for men because little kids are really fun. I mean, they can be annoying, but they're really fun. And I do think, though, that Lynn, that, in terms of politics, I'm trying to think who you might have. Trump gets a passing message, Tucker Carlson.
There's so many.
Putin. But, really just walk the halls of Congress, or the Senate building. I mean, it's each one, with a couple exceptions, but each one is more narcissistic than the next.
It really is a place where you could just study textbook examples. Yes, for sure. For sure.
And a society that is run politically, a government that is run by and for narcissists, and an electoral system that rewards narcissism too, and I think that's getting worse and worse too. I mean, I think it's, the things that were considered, the sort of collective conscience and a sense of taboos and everything else, that's gone now. You can just brave that out, as Trump and others have shown, with just absolute narcissistic bravado. You just, it doesn't matter. It's almost, there's very little you can do to get thrown out now, or to be considered too dishonorable to win, as long as you can keep drawing attention to yourself.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. This psychiatrist that I mentioned, Alan Francis, who has been involved in writing the definitions for the DSM on narcissistic personality disorder, made a really interesting comment about Trump. He said something to the effect of, it's really difficult to consider Trump as a case of narcissistic personality disorder because according to the definition in psychiatry and psychology, it means traits that inhibit you from succeeding in life. Trump's traits have not inhibited him from succeeding in life. He became the president of the United States. So we obviously have a system whereby these traits are profoundly rewarded. Elon Musk is the second richest person in the world. Sam Bankman-Fried hailed as a genius, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can go on. But one interesting conversation that I've heard about this that really intrigued me, I don't know if it's true, but it's a question that I think is interesting to think about in terms of narcissistic traits becoming more dominant, is that the population keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. And so how does a person stand out? How does a person get recognized in a sea of billions of people? Well, perhaps you have to be a little bit more extreme. The fantasy has to be a little bit bolder. You want to get likes on social media. You're not going to get that unless you distinguish yourself as an individual from everybody else. And I thought that was an intriguing idea, that the more people we have, the more narcissistic we're kind of forced to be, and I use the word compete in this capitalistic society that we have.
It sounds like hell, like literal divine eternal punishment to me. But then that's how the internet feels to me most of the time anyway. Andy Warhol, famously said that in the future we'll all be famous for 15 minutes. It's like 11 microseconds now. Yeah. So, well, this is really fun. What do you think 2023 will be if 2022 is the year of the narcissist?
Well, since we haven't really fundamentally changed anything, I think we're just going to see, unfortunately, more of this activity and behavior. Maybe people will think twice about making anti-Semitic comments if they want to keep their brand, going. But it'll just morph into something else. I don't think this is going away. And I think as we've touched upon here, there are many forces that are amplifying it until we really rethink some fundamentals about the way we arrange our society and the way we bring up and teach children.
Well, then it's a good thing we have such wise and effective voices speaking out against it as myself. No,
Exactly.
Right.
We're the truth tellers here. We're the altruists.
Absolutely. They're so lucky they have us. But no, this is a great set of observations. And as always, I really enjoyed the conversation. Lynn Parramore is a cultural historian and writer, and the piece was headlined in Think NBC News. A Think page was entitled "Good Riddance to the Year of the Narcissist." So with that, as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, thanks so much. Always a pleasure to be with you.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero.